Experiences of formal and informal learning environments.
So this work is part of a larger project where I was exploring English language learner use of mobile tools and their experiences of learning English and communicating in English dominant environments. So we know that English language learners are underperforming when they're compared to first language speakers, and that's shown through a variety of different tests, national standards in the US. And they also have trouble communicating using English, and there have been claims that this is different across learning contexts, but the majority of analytics that we have come from formal learning environments, and we definitely aren't tracking their communication in informal learning environments. So if we look at analytics across contexts, again, formal environments have a lot of assessment and monitoring. It's fairly easy to instrument those environments, at least comparative to Starbucks and everywhere else that you might encounter in the world as you're going around in it. So these informal environments are far more complex, a little harder to predict what will happen in them, and definitely harder to monitor within those environments. So how can we capture information across these contexts? So I'm proposing a method that I'm going to show in the particular context of English language learning where we can capture analytics across those contexts. I used a mixed methods approach where I combined semi-structured interviews with assessments of domain knowledge and a particular form of self-reporting and self-assessment that I will get into in more detail, and that's where I will focus most of today on. I was collecting validated measures of self-efficacy, affect, and then measures of their self-reported perception of how successfully they had communicated with others in their environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the interviews first because I primarily used them to gather additional information about their experiences and strategies of communication and learning, but I also used them to clarify the self-report data. So because they were sending me data in at different intervals and through a particular application, I needed to make sure that I was interpreting that properly. So it's kind of like member checking and qualitative where you do all the interpretation and give it to your participant and have them tell you whether or not you interpreted something properly, but it was more iterative and ongoing than that. So the method I used is experience sampling, and it comes out of phenomenology and an attempt to quantify how people perceive their own experiences. And what I did is I took their day from when they woke up to when they went to bed, broke it up into 6 time periods. The first 5 time periods collected a self-report measure for their current experience. And then at the end of the day, the 6th period was a daily reflection of their entire day for different measures as similar to a diary study. And because this was combined with a single subject design that I'm not going to get into right now, that was what I'd had that to monitor their stability so I could transition them between phases. In the momentary, they did 3 self-reports of their affect, and I used 2 different measures. The first was the international short form of the positive and negative affect schedule, which looks at valence and arousal, but it's linguistic in nature, and because I didn't know the language abilities of my participants beforehand, I also used the self-assessment mannequin to ensure that I had some measure that I could use in order to compare their affect across different situations, because it's pictorial. However, it hadn't been validated cross-culturally, so I didn't know whether or not people would interpret it similarly. The other 2 momentary reports collected a self-assessment rating from basically 0 to 100% successful, and then they also told me what they were trying to communicate. And there were 3 methods that they could do, any combination of. They could type something in. If they typed it in English, there was the auto-suggest typing support. They could record themselves speaking in whichever language they chose. There was the only proviso that they had to tell me which language they were using so that I could translate it if it was one that I wasn't familiar with, or they could take a photo of whatever they were trying to communicate. At the end of the day, I collected both affect and communication measures. I also collected an estimate of how much communication they had done over the course of the day. So this was done with a much smaller N than anyone else here is really doing. And that partly has to do with the rest of the project. It was fairly well balanced with advanced English language learners in this case. And that's a population that often isn't studied when they're in a second language environment where they're surrounded by English and have to use it every day to survive. My participants came from 3 different home languages, Brazilian speakers of Portuguese, Arabic, and Kazakh. And I'll get into some more details about them in a little bit, I think. But first I want to talk about how they used the tool that I had them reporting their data through. So there were several affordances that encouraged them to submit their data. Some of them were technical. Let's see anything here. Okay. So allowing them to take a photo allowed expediency in their self-reporting. But they also liked being able to type, and there were social affordances because it didn't look like they were doing anything different. So it didn't stand out to those in their environment. The other thing is, because it would buzz at them to tell them to complete the questionnaire, everyone thought they were getting a text or a phone call and was like, you have to check your phone, you have to check your phone. So that helped with data collection. But there were other things that discouraged their submission. And these come down primarily to logistical and attentional barriers. So if they'd left their phone somewhere else, they were in the middle of something that they felt was important or were very concentrated on something, and then social barriers. So when they were, one participant didn't want to do it in the middle of a fight with a loved one. I don't think that's the quote I have though. Yeah, he's like, no, I'm not stopping. I got a report later. And then they didn't want to, if they were engaged with someone who didn't necessarily know what was going on or who they weren't close with and felt comfortable explaining that they were participating in this study, they didn't want to do different aspects of it. So overall, the compliance, so the percentage of samples that they submitted was quite high, and I could use 11 of the 12 participants. One of them I'd removed, and they were in this study between 3 weeks and 33 days, so only the one was removed. We also see a reasonable number of submissions for samples. However, the majority of their samples are coming for their momentary or coming from informal environments, even though their classroom environment was using a communicative approach. So you would have expected potentially higher values and numbers of reports from that environment, considering they were in their classroom for about half of every weekday. The number of times they tried to communicate over the course of the day is about 10. That's where our median is. So it would have been nice if it had been a little higher. However, those who were more successful were the ones who were trying to communicate more. And we see that increase, and that's from the daily measures. If we look at the momentary measures, and higher is better here, so from 0 to 100%, what we see is at the bottom, we have more communication failure in informal settings, and those are less constrained. We look at a few examples of why, or the types of topics where they had success and failure. In informal environments, they had success when it was a very constrained task, like asking for medication, and they tended to fail when it was more abstract and social, so discussing and describing their emotions. In formal environments, it wasn't quite the same distinction. So with Inju here, her presentation was on architecture, and she'd made it very broad and applicable to everyone because she was presenting to a class of engineers. So she'd kept it very simple, and that allowed her to be successful. Whereas with Edith, who was in nutrition, she hadn't been that strategic in her choice of topic and really struggled with defining technical terms for her classmates so that they could understand the presentation. And that's why her success was so low. So the barriers that they reported for the causes of these failures when they were having troubles with comprehension related to speakers' rate of speech and accents, and this study was conducted in the Toronto area. So there are a lot of non-native speakers of English, and in service industries, you often have to deal with a variety of accents, and this was a struggle for the English language learners. Of course, they struggled with colloquialisms and vocabulary. And then the other one is how cooperative their communication partner was. Were they willing to repeat themselves? Were they willing to try and talk slower and otherwise explain or scaffold the communication? So if we move from communication into affect, partly because these barriers are linked to frustration and negative affect, we see very similar affect levels across context, and the measures were reliable. I'm only going to talk about the PANAS, partly because it's correlated with the SAM and they were fairly consistent, but it also has higher discriminant validity, and I'm able to separate it into the positive and negative aspects so we can look at it in a little more detail. So we see that they did experience more negative affect than positive affect, And it's about 1.75 times as high for negative affect as positive. And if we look at across participants here, we want lower numbers this time, so those will be considered better. And what we see is we have this group of participants at the top who are pretty much maxing out their negative affect for at least half of every day. Their stress levels are so high that we aren't seeing the variability that you would normally expect in someone's negative affect. Normally you would expect that to be fairly variable, and it wasn't here. So this consistently high negative affect, which was tied to their attempts at communication, so those who had high affect were less likely to try and communicate with others, leads us to believe that they need a little bit of additional support. However, it's not tied to their self-efficacy. So even though they had really high negative affect, it wasn't affecting their perception of their abilities to communicate or their learning, even though there is a relationship between the negative affect and both of those things. If we go beyond their need for emotional support, which is indicated by this, both in class and out of class, but especially out of class, we also see that this tool could be used by them for their self-monitoring regulation. And this is one of the things that surprised me. I knew it was possible that it would influence their perceptions of themselves, but they actually actively used it to monitor what their behaviors were, and in some cases for Inka, to adjust her behaviors. So when she got signaled for communication and had been asked what her most recent attempt at communication was like, she would actually go call somebody, delay reporting. She never actually did complete the reporting, and then move on. So what this very small study shows is that we can capture and analyze the experiences of learners across contexts using techniques like experience sampling when they're combined with established measures, as well as open responses. The established measures that I used, such as affect, could apply across various domains. The communication one likely won't, and the software that I've developed, I'm more than happy to share if people want to modify it. It's relatively easy if you have a programming background to modify. The actual learner experiences exposed a need for tools that support their affect, support their oral comprehension, which is relatively well known anyway, specifically addressing though accent and rate of speech, and how to do that in a social situation requires a little more work, as well as how to develop strategies and tools that they can use in order to address when communication partners aren't being cooperative. And with that, I would like to open the floor up to questions.
Okay, who would like to ask the first question?
Thank you. I found this really interesting, especially the app part of it, so I appreciate that you're willing to potentially share that. Can you tell us a little bit about the development of that? You did that yourself. Does it have a name? I assume, by the way it looked, that students were doing it on their cell phone, so it's for the mobile phone. Was it across platforms?
It's Android-based. I developed it in coordination with someone else, and I actually lived with this app and used the application for 5 months straight while testing it. So I know exactly what my participants went through, and even to a greater extent. I wasn't going to give them something that could be as annoying as this is, without doing it. That said, a lot of my participants started treating it like a journal. They didn't find it annoying. A few did, and that's always going to happen. So the app basically signals you randomly within each of those time blocks and buzzes, but you can postpone submitting a signal for up to 20 minutes. And then once you're outside of your time block, it's just that opportunity is gone. Have I answered everything?
Did you name it?
Oh, sorry, yes. We're calling it MyLog. It's just a name.
So I had a couple of questions because considering that the sample size is small, you had a slide where you said that you concluded that self-efficacy and I can't remember what the other one was, were not related to either the stress or their performance level. But do you believe that you have enough data to actually conclude that? Just because the p-value was more than 0.5.
I don't know that it generalizes to other learners. It was a significant correlation only, but.
So you mentioned that they're basically, at least some of them are basically stressed out all the time,
Yeah.
which sounds like a real problem for their life in general. Are there any things that you're looking at for for a next study to try and help address that or mitigate that in any way?
I'm not sure how to deal with that. That's not my primary focus. My focus is actually on supporting their language learning, and the affect measurement was really intended to capture aspects of the support we were trying to provide through another app. And in another paper, those who used the app extensively, they had slight improvements in their affect, and then their affect re-skyrocketed after we took the app away, because it was an ABA design.
Other questions?
Thanks, Carrie. I think this is really interesting work. I just picked up on one thing. I was wondering whether you might be able to comment on it, about the difficulty to communicate when emotion was involved. And I'm particularly interested in that in the context of reflective writing. Like, if we ask students who are learning English to write about their own emotions, are we likely to encounter more are we likely to make their lives more difficult by asking them to do that? Did you get any sense from that, from your study?
So I probably did imply that. I didn't intend to. What I meant to say was that when they were in a very heated emotional situation, they didn't respond to the survey tool. They'd tell me about it later. It wasn't so much that they had difficulty communicating in that setting as they just weren't willing to interrupt the situation.
Carrie, I have a follow-up question actually related to yours. I think it relates to when you select your sample students, you said they are advanced level students. So how do you make the cutoff line to say like these students are advanced level? Is there specific metrics?
They were above IELTS 6, but not as high as IELTS 6.5. And that was a condition of the academic program that we recruited them through.
Other questions? Okay then, thank you all for a great session.
Thank you.